There's a quiet damnation in having to follow a stellar act, an expectation from the audience. The headliner that plays after the shockingly good opener, the main event match that just can't gather the crowd after the battleground of tables, ladders, and chairs that came before it. The finale episode that can't quite match the energy of the climactic and emotional one before. That doesn't mean that what comes after is necessarily worse, but it almost requires a different eye. Resident Evil 4 set the precedent incredibly high for the horror franchise, a new evolution for the genre and series. It carved a new path forward, new tools were used, new areas were explored. How are you supposed to follow that? How are you supposed to manage to live up to that expectation? The answer is, you can't. In this way, Resident Evil 5 was sort of given a raw deal, fated to be misremembered and underrated, no matter how good it could be. But in isolation, the game is pretty great. Does it stand up to the likes of 4 or the Resident Evil 1 remake? Not at all. But it does manage to put its own twist on the action genre that Resident Evil 4 set up in the last entry. The melee system is extrapolated upon to include more combos. The combat is a bit more fast-paced, and the plot is absolutely bananas. While Resident Evil 5 starts out pretty grounded, it goes off the rails by the last hour or two. It manages to set its goal early on, to wrap up the history of the series, to uncover its mysteries and reveal where all this really started. At the same time, in the present, we are wrapping up Chris's story, Wesker's story, and Jill's. But the game shirks the box that normal conventions try to put around it, like a beast trying to bust open from a cage. Flying steel bars whip past your head, and if the introduction was grounded, then the finale is in space, firmly planted on the moon. This is some of the most fun that the series has ever had. It does manage to take itself seriously in some parts, though. Themes of partnership, progress turning to indifference, and vengeance persist throughout the story. And while Resident Evil 4 was the first time a mainline game in the series felt like it had a pretty hefty tale, Resident Evil 5 feels like the first time that the series tries to build these characters up with interesting motivations. Combining these two, a lighthearted action story with insane twists and set pieces, with interesting characters who feel like they have depth, makes for an absolutely fantastic time. And in some ways, the systems that Resident Evil 5 does use do actually work. The game feels fast-paced, and the hordes of zombies attacking us can get overwhelming pretty quickly. The weapons feel good to use, the upgrade system is interesting, and the action is fantastic. But in a lot of areas, Resident Evil 5 feels like a step down from its predecessor, and that just isn't because the fourth game set the bar so high, it's because Resident Evil 5 makes deliberate changes and removes upgrades that were so welcome in the last game. The attaché case is gone, and Resident Evil once again relies on a system that sees items taking up one slot in a 9-slot inventory. The merchant is gone, and buying and selling is now relegated to one screen in between chapters. The treasure system has been nerfed, with the player no longer allowed to combine treasures for bigger rewards. There certainly are drawbacks to this game, and I wouldn't call it one of my favorites in the series, but it gets so much right in tone, story, and lore that I just knew I was going to love it. The game knows exactly when to take itself seriously and when to just have some fun. But with serious problems holding it back, that means that Resident Evil 5 becomes sort of a mixed bag, but it was always destined to be this way. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. I'll be dissecting Resident Evil 5 and everything from gameplay to story to mechanics. And if you haven't seen the previous videos in the series, I would highly recommend checking them out in this playlist here. There's a lot of story, background, and history that leads up to this point, and I will most likely spoil at least some of the previous games in this video, as well as Resident Evil 5. If you enjoy the video, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to the channel. You can also subscribe to my Patreon, the link to which is in the description. I've been reviewing the Resident Evil movies over there and have completed all of the Paul W.S. Anderson movies. If you want to see me lose my mind, It's a really good time. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Resident Evil 5. After the release of Resident Evil 4 in 2005, Shinji Mikami would officially leave the Resident Evil series for good. He exited Production Studio 4 and went to Clover Team, still within Capcom. Kamiya was already on this team and had created the Beautiful Joe games, which had done very well for Capcom and the GameCube. Mikami would develop God Hand while at Clover Team, and Kamiya would develop Okami. This output was short-lived though, because in 2006, Clover Studio was shut down, and many high-profile developers left the company. Hideki Kamiya, Shinji Mikami, and Atsushi Inaba specifically. This was partly due to friction with Capcom's executive rules. At the time, they were requiring that 70 to 80% of new projects had to be sequels to existing IP. Obviously feeling stifled by these directives, these developers chose to go their own way. With Clover Team dissolved, a lot of the remaining team members at Capcom would be shifted over to working on Resident Evil 5, which had already started development at this point. The game officially entered production in 2005 with Jun Takeuchi as producer, and both Yasuhiro Anpo and Kenichi Ueda as directors. Takeuchi had been working on the series since Resident Evil 1, where he did character modeling and motion design. Anpo had also been around since the beginning, doing programming for Resident Evil 1 and 2. Ueda had joined the series on Resident Evil 3, so while Mikami's departure from the company was a big hit, there were still a lot of series veterans working on the next game. Pretty early on in development, Resident Evil 5 was designated as a co-op forward game. This meant that while the mechanic was optional, co-op play was a big part of the game's design. Anpo himself enjoyed the idea, likening it to enjoying the scares of a haunted house with a friend. Despite what most people assumed, Resident Evil 5's co-op system was not developed as an extension of the previous zapping system we saw in Resident Evil 0. It was built from the ground up as its own separate thing. While co-op was a large focus for Resident Evil 5, so were the graphics. The team at Capcom really wanted to push the boundaries with this entry in terms of fidelity. Utilizing the new hardware that the next generation systems, the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, offered them, they could achieve a new level of realism. This meant character models could be designed with greater detail. Facial animations were handcrafted, at certain points even down to the muscles. The mocap team was using new technology, including a camera that allowed them to move a virtual camera around and get pinpoint control of the shots in the game. This enabled the cutscenes to have a handheld feel to them, if that's what was needed. At the time, only 4 of these cameras existed in the world, so Capcom was really trying to make Resident Evil 5 a truly big-budget game. They also had a new engine this time around. During development of Lost Planet, Capcom had created an in-house engine called MT Framework. This engine was created because a lot of teams on previous games were using engines that they created for their specific projects. Crafting an engine that could be used across the studio would be particularly useful and efficient at getting people on the same page. This engine was first used for Dead Rising, then Lost Planet, Devil May Cry 4, and then Resident Evil 5. The engine would be updated over the years, but is now mostly viewed as the precursor to Capcom's famous RE engine that they still currently use for development. With around 4 years in development, Resident Evil 5 was released on March 5th, 2009 in Japan, March 12th, 2009 in Australia, and March 13th, 2009 in both North America and Europe, all for the Sony PlayStation 3 and Microsoft's Xbox 360. The PC version wasn't released until 6 months later in September of 2009, but it was the version of the game that I played for this video. It's the most easily available version, and I didn't find anything particularly distinct that stuck out to me. It is worth noting that originally the PC version of the game came with stereoscopic 3D, which was provided through the use of DirectX 10. This was included in the original Games for Windows Live version though, and has since been removed from modern releases. But it was the first game to be released with full stereoscopic 3D, which is a pretty interesting note for gaming history. Resident Evil 5 opens with a hooded figure standing menacingly over a kneeling individual. We see Humvees whipping into towns, seemingly some sort of military presence making a move. The hooded figure eventually leaves the gentleman on the ground, who is quickly overtaken by some sort of parasite. We then see our main character, Chris Redfield, driving his own Humvee down a desert road. His narration sets up the game. Since Umbrella's fall, which we covered in between some of the previous games, their bioweapons have now ended up in the hands of various terrorist groups. A lot of this stuff is better detailed in files that the game will give us after completing certain chapters, but we'll get there eventually. The spread of these bioweapons left a trail of fear across the globe, as smaller nations anticipated another Raccoon City-like outbreak and aftermath. The Global Consortium of Pharmaceuticals, or the GCP, formed anti-bioterrorism units called the BSAA, which Chris was one of the founding members of. The general goal of the BSAA was to send teams into areas where BOWs had been released and neutralize them. It was basically a global peacekeeping mission to prevent massive outbreaks and deaths at the hands of BOWs. In general, I love the idea of the BSAA. It's such a great way to extend the story of the Resident Evil world while also removing it from being constantly tied to Umbrella. Of course, Umbrella were the ones that started all of this, but weirdly this new storyline feels like it fits in so much with what Resident Evil 4 was trying to set up. This is a new world now, and everything that happened in the original trilogy has had cascading real effects that this world now has to deal with. When Chris gets into town, he meets another BSAA operative named Sheva Alomar. Resident Evil 5 takes place in Kijuju, a fictional African country. Kijuju has had a recent change in government that has caused massive terrorist uprisings in the area. The locals aren't going to be happy seeing Chris here, so Sheva is here to guide him throughout the area. As Chris welcomes his new partner to the team, he gets hung up on that word.
That's why I'm your partner. Help put them at ease.
Well, I'm sure you'll do just fine.
Sometime between now and when we last saw her, Jill seems to have died, and Chris is still very much mourning his loss.
Casualties continue to mount over the long years I've struggled. More and more, I find myself wondering if it's all worth fighting for. Maybe one day, I'll find out.
Sheva and Chris are stopped by the local mercs, but are eventually let inside the nearby town. Chris is determined to complete his mission, the reason that he was sent here by the BSAA. This completes the prologue and begins Chapter 1-1. Resident Evil 5 has a similar layout to Resident Evil 4 in that each section of the game is split up into chapters and subchapters. Kijuju is the setting for the first chapter of the game, a small African city with narrow streets and tons of small, makeshift buildings. A lot of the structures in the area have clear additions, jutting out, comprised of different materials. Clearly a community that is getting by rather than thriving on their own. Being pushed into the nearby alleys leaves the player basked in shadow, and while much of Resident Evil 5 is set in the daylight, the game often oscillates back and forth between moments of bright sunshine and periods of darkness, either inside buildings or underground. It's this constant shifting that creates environmental tension and horror, being railroaded into a tight corridor, forced into a building to defend yourself against the threat. This makes the city of Kijuju a terrifying place. Large open areas give way to railroaded dead-end alleyways and homes with only 2 exits. Just like Resident Evil 4, we're often weaving in and out of buildings to get ourselves some space and combat. But similarly to the previous entry in the series, Resident Evil 5 also pushes the outsider theme even further. Chris obviously feels like an outsider in this area, so much so that he needs a guide to take him through it. Once again, we are out of place, a foreigner in an unfamiliar land, a place that has its own problems outside of the coming infection. The outsider distinction makes Chris feel as if he doesn't belong, and that is, once again, an established way to further the horror in this new era of Resident Evil. Before we talk about the first chapter of the game, we should probably talk about gameplay in general and how things have changed from the massive shakeup that was Capcom's Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 5, from a base level, functions pretty similarly to the previous entry. We have an over-the-shoulder camera that tracks behind our character. The game is more action-focused, with melee combat helping you conserve ammunition, and collecting currency and upgrading weapons is a core part of the gameplay. This foundation that Resident Evil 4 laid out is still there, but the devil is really in the details when it comes to this game. First of all, combat is just a slight bit faster than Resident Evil 4. You'll notice as you're fighting off swarms of the infected that enemies are a bit quicker to grab, quicker to attack, faster to lunge. But this is offset by the fact that you have a partner with you at all times, probably one of the largest changes that Resident Evil 5 makes to its core gameplay loop. This game puts the focus on cooperative gameplay, a large trend that was already happening around this era. This was largely a phenomenon set by the Gears of War franchise, of which Resident Evil 5 got a lot of comparisons to right out of the gate. In this title, we mainly play the game through the eyes of Chris Redfield, our main character. He is generally who the story is centered around, and his partner, Sheva Alomar, is his partner, but ultimately a side character. We can play the game entirely solo, controlling Chris manually and seeing Sheva operated by an AI, but if we choose to play the game with a friend, then the player hosting the game will play Chris, and Sheva will be played by the joining party. Most people consider the game to be much better when playing with another person. The full playthrough of the game that I did for this video was solo, but I did play through the first half of the game in co-op. Shout out to Evan Prince for helping me out with that one. But most of the comments I found online about Resident Evil 5 noted that it was worse when you played it solo. I can't tell if this is mostly because of complaints about Sheva's AI, or if it was because people had associated the game with the person they had played it with. Faint memories of better times, of connection with another individual, rather than the quality of the game itself. It seems to be some mix of both, but I will mostly be critiquing the game from a solo standpoint. I do think that if a game allows you to play it solo, then it should be just as good as the co-op version of the game. And for the first half of the game, I would have told you that Sheva's AI is pretty great, that it mostly protects you and keeps enemies off of you, that it holds up its end of the bargain in taking out foes, that it doesn't really hold back. But towards the second half of the game, this just isn't really true. At a certain point, Sheva just really stops participating in combat for the most part. Of course, you do have to keep her supplied with ammo. You can trade weapons and items in the new inventory system, which no longer pauses while you're organizing your belongings. Everything is still happening in the background. Sheva will use the ammunition and weapons that we give her at her will when playing on solo. If out of ammo, then Sheva will notify us and we can give her more. She can also salvage nearby containers for ammunition, but will stop if we approach the same container. Thankfully, Resident Evil 5 does give us the option to toggle friendly fire on or off, so Sheva doesn't have to worry about getting in front of our shots. Now, overall, I would say that the Sheva AI is pretty good across the board. I mostly say this because Sheva has a lot to deal with. She has to manage attacking enemies, trying not to get in our way, collecting new ammo, handing us ammo when she's found stuff she can't use, healing us and herself, etc. There's a lot on the AI's plate here, and the closest thing we can really compare this to is the previous game, Resident Evil 4, and Ashley's AI. If you remember, I praised Ashley's AI quite a bit, and I still maintain that it was great, but that's because Ashley's AI had far less to deal with. She was basically just meant to follow us and stay out of the way of attacks. Comparatively, Sheva is dealing with a lot more here. This is all to say that I don't put too much negative stock in Sheva's AI sort of breaking down towards the second half of the game. And really, when Sheva isn't as active, we're just playing the true solo version of Resident Evil 5, when it's just Chris. It is true that Resident Evil 5 does play better when you have two people to actually use the co-op system, but in some ways, that actually makes the game far too easy. The normal mode difficulty for this game is basically a breeze when you play co-op mode, and that actually removes some of the horror from the game. Yasuhiro Onpo specifically said of the co-op system, "I thought of it like enjoying the scares in a ghost house with a friend." He also states that enjoyment comes first with horror, and that to get horror to be effective, there needed to be some enjoyment there to begin with. Unfortunately, I'm going to have to disagree with him on this point. Sure, at a fundamental level, you need to enjoy the game that you're playing, but usually horror games utilize the overcoming of tension, fear, and atmosphere to progress the player. Satisfying puzzles, level design, and combat encounters propel the player forward in the absence of traditional enjoyment or fun. Because at its core, horror should be somewhat terrifying, an experience that is kind of the antithesis of fun. I do enjoy the time I spend with games like Silent Hill 2 or Resident Evil 1 Remake, but I wouldn't exactly call those games fun. At least on the first playthrough, they're terrifying experiences that are mostly littered with uncertainty. And even Resident Evil 4 had a certain level of horror to it. There were dark moments, when the day turned to night and the Ganados transformed, when the back paths turned to laboratory halls and we were stalked by regenerators. But Resident Evil 5 feels mostly devoid of this type of horror. It's still there, but mostly present in the form of intensity rather than atmosphere. Don't get me wrong, this isn't a total criticism. Sure, is there a void where the horror once was? Yes, but the action focus that this game brings does make it feel quite distinct in the overall lineup, and it certainly separates it from Resident Evil 4. I would much prefer the atmosphere of something like the cramped halls of the first remake or the dark laboratory of Resident Evil 4, but this game's action works to further its story and world. In Resident Evil 5, we will stand stationary while we aim. Fans had complained as early as the demo that moving while shooting hadn't been implemented, considering it was more commonplace in this generation already. We still have what is effectively a merchant mechanic in the game, but instead of encountering the merchant at different points across the story, the merchant mechanic is relegated to the breakpoint in between each subchapter. Oh, and there's also no actual merchant here, it's just a blank screen. We can still sell treasures that we find here though, and buy new weapons or upgrade old ones. Personally, I think this system is infinitely worse than Resident Evil 4's implementation. First of all, we can't combine treasures anymore, even though the game makes a distinction between larger treasures and small gems. This means that we have a lot less engagement with the system overall. There's no more reason to keep treasures over the long term, no prolonged gratification, just instant. This means that treasures are just effectively currency, one step removed, and at that point you might as well just replace all treasures with base currency. They only exist at this point for flair. Nothing extra is provided to the player outside of aesthetics. Also, only encountering the sell screen in between chapters means that we have less opportunities to trade in items and swap things out, or at least it's less in-world. In Resident Evil 4, you were always waiting for the next merchant encounter, waiting for his blue flames to pop up around the corner so that you could get a power upgrade or grab one of those weapons that you traded in earlier. It's even stranger though, because every time we die, we get access to the sell screen again, no matter where we are in the chapter. This system, like many others, just feels like a massive downgrade when compared to Resident Evil 4. You could just say, well, don't compare it to Resident Evil 4, but this game truly does feel like the next evolution of that game. You surely can't compare it to the original trilogy of games, because it doesn't really resemble those at all, but it's just also so different from the game that it does so closely resemble. This also extends to the inventory system, where before we had the attaché case providing each weapon and item with its own space allocation. We now just have a 9-slot inventory system. Each item takes up the same amount of space, with certain ammunition having stack limits, and once those are hit, new items transfer to another stack. It feels much closer to the systems we had in the original Resident Evil trilogy, but that doesn't exactly feel like it fits here. That would be like making this game have a fixed camera system. That wouldn't exactly fit with the design of Resident Evil 5, so it wouldn't be warranted. But because we've essentially regressed here, it feels like the game lacks something in the inventory realm. I'm sure that this was to simplify inventory management so that you could have a system which forces you to quickly adjust your inventory while combat is going on. This does make this action more intense, trying to swap to a grenade while being overcome by a horde, or trying to equip a new weapon while a boss chases after you. These moments are fast-paced and reward quick actions. Taking too long puts you in a bad position, damages your character, and costs you resources. It's a bit of a trade-off of systems, but I really prefer the previous attaché case system. I just really like managing the inventory spaces, and I think it's a better way of engaging the player than just limiting inventory to 9 slots. Of course, you technically have 18 slots total when you factor in your partner's inventory space, but it's just a little bland when you compare it to the depth that Resident Evil 4 had. This game does make some upgrades, especially in the form of melee combat. If you remember, in Resident Evil 4, you could stun enemies and then follow up with a melee attack. This, of course, reduces this amount of ammo that you have to use and feeds back into the action style that both of these games take. Resident Evil 5 has this as well, but Chris has more attacks at his disposal than Leon. He can do an uppercut, a straight, a hook, and stomp enemies on the ground. It's pretty satisfying to combo these attacks together and bash enemy heads in. This also greatly reflects the change in Chris Redfield that we haven't really talked about yet. Maybe you haven't noticed, but Chris is fucking jacked in this game. There's a long-running meme in the Resident Evil community that Chris got so smoked by Wesker in his last battle with him that he started really hitting the weights so that would never happen again. But it's very believable that Chris could just straight up deliver a sickening stomp to the head of a Las Plagas infected enemy. Honestly, even more so than Leon. And his new design really makes a lot of the crazy stuff that happens in this game a bit more believable in the long run. I think overall, though, the gameplay in Resident Evil 5 is pretty good. It mostly functions like Resident Evil 4, with changes that, outside of the ones I've already discussed, come in the form of enemy types, boss battles, and later mechanics that we'll get into in a bit. The only real changes made here are just small regressions, which aren't that annoying, but do put it a step below Resident Evil 4 in my opinion. Starting back at Chapter 1-1, Chris and Sheva make their way through Kijuju. As we start moving along the streets, we are given a small briefing from Kirk, a helicopter pilot for the BSAA. Chris and Sheva's mission is to help stop a black market weapons deal that's about to go down in the area. The individual in question is Ricardo Irving, a notable dealer in the area. Since BOWs are now on the black market, these dealers buy and sell mutated species as they would guns or missiles. Alpha Team has already made forward progress in the area, and Chris and Sheva's immediate goal is to get their gear along with a debriefing and meet up with them. As we walk through the city, we can find the citizens of this town acting quite strange. A group of men nearby are beating some sort of animal in a sack. This is not unlike the burning of the policeman that we saw in Resident Evil 4, not so subtly hinting to the player that this area may have already been infected. Chris and Sheva immediately notice something in the air, though. Passioned Swahili can be heard spoken from a nearby radio. The townsfolk seem to have disappeared. Something is off. Heading into a nearby building, we'll meet our contact. He explains the feeling that we picked up on pretty quickly. Everyone is on edge with the new government and political issues in the area. He provides us with our weapons, a pistol for each character loaded with 10 bullets, and a pack to carry everything in. The contact tells us to head to the town square and meet up with Alpha Team at the deal location. He also clues us into another lead. Project Ouroboros, a rumored doomsday virus, seems to be a reality. Irving, the man involved in the deal, seems like a good lead to the project, and we might be able to get some information from him. With that, he disappears, leaving only parting words of caution.
You must find a man named Irving. He is our only lead. And be careful out there.
Just outside of this building, we see another animal killed, seemingly with arrows or sticks of some kind. And in the next building, scenes of gore and viscera left out on the table. In the next house, we're treated to a particularly grotesque scene. A man is shoving a live parasite into another man's mouth. The victim is then infected and lunges for Sheva and Chris, our first enemy of the game. There's something so brutal about this sequence and the way the cutscene is directed. The close-up, shaky shots of the man's face, resisting the coming infection, his eyes and their bleeding, this new level of fidelity that it's presented in. Every time I saw this scene, my stomach just dropped a little. It's also very similar to the first enemy we face in Resident Evil 4, except that we see the transformation in this man, something that will be important later in the game. Once this cutscene ends, the shackles have been unleashed, the townsfolk are revealed to be infected, and it's now, finally, time to survive. We're attacked in a nearby alleyway by a horde of enemies, and we have to make a run for it. Chris and Sheva barricade themselves in a nearby building to get away from this mass of enemies. Chris contacts Kirk to update him on the situation, but the mission hasn't changed. We still have to find Irving. The mission still stands. Heading through an underground tunnel, we can arrive in the town square. Here there is a demonstration going on. A man is yelling Swahili into a microphone, and two others have someone held down. The man being held is the contact that we talked to earlier. Before we can do anything, he is quickly executed by a massive creature standing to the side with an axe. We are then left to fend for ourselves as the group and the large axe-wielding monster is set upon us. What follows is probably one of my favorite segments in the game. It's a subversion of the previous game's house defense sequence, as we're quickly given the same scenario. Enemies are flooding towards us, and we can block the doors and windows with bookcases. They soon destroy these defenses, but they eventually start pouring in through the ceiling, and even the wall itself is destroyed by the executioner. The fight then spills out into the town square as we have to run around and frantically try to defend ourselves before Kirk can arrive and get us out of there. It's such an intense moment that slowly builds and progresses as it goes. I will say that it probably goes on a bit too long for its own good, but it is great nonetheless. The executioner is also worthy of note here because he's extremely hard to kill, especially with our early game weapons. He's an example of great enemy design in this game, though I do think he's veering a bit too close to Silent Hill territory because he drags his axe in a pretty similar way to Pyramid Head. After we survive this sequence, Kirk blasts the door that's blocking our exit. This ends Chapter 1-1 and begins Chapter 1-2. Chris and Sheva are once again tasked with heading to the coordinates that the deal is taking place at. On the way, we head through some cramped side streets. Sheva eventually has to split off from Chris to grab a key upstairs. There are brief moments like this throughout the whole game, times where Sheva will have to handle something and Chris will be tasked with covering her with fire from afar. It's a pretty neat mechanic that makes both characters feel distinct, like they have areas of expertise. Chris is obviously strong enough to toss Sheva up to the roof, and Sheva is nimble enough to do so. It furthers the theme of partnership and working together that the game has as well. It makes Chris and Sheva stronger as two colleagues, which is important for the end of the game to work. As we enter the next area, a woman screams out for help. She's dragged inside by one of the infected, and by the time we get to her, she's already been infected. This means we officially see the physical transformation of the new Plagas that Resident Evil 5 has, the Type 2 Las Plagas. Now, while Resident Evil 5's story is interesting, a lot of it is tied up in these optional files that we receive upon completing chapters of the game. We also can, of course, pick up memos throughout the game that will add context to the overall story. I'm going to say that I think some of these memos are the most interesting in the series so far, and actually have really unique themes that I didn't expect from this game. But the long files in the menus is where we really start to get a ton of background information on the story. Some of these are basically short stories with character dialogue and everything. We'll get back to those in a moment, but one of the memos we find later will tell us a lot about the Type 2 Plagas. The Type 2 Plagas was being tested in this area, and the big thing that sets it apart from its predecessor is that the parasite could be matured outside of a host. This means that you could administer the mature parasite to its new host, and that host would be infected immediately, rather than having to wait for the parasite to mature like the Las Plagas we encountered in Spain did. This is why we see the man being force-fed a parasite and then instantly transforming. Kijuju is currently being used as a test site for the Type 2 Plagas, the next iteration of these deadly viruses. Whoever was behind this virus wanted an infected crowd that they could control very quickly, and they got it. After defeating this enemy, Chris and Sheva can head to the nearby meeting point, where we find Alpha Team absolutely eviscerated. We can find one member still hanging on to life, though. He tells Chris that Irving, the black market dealer we're looking for, set this whole thing up. He got away, and Alpha Team fell right into a trap. He downloaded some data, though, that might help, and passes it off to Chris in the hopes that he'll deliver it to HQ. Sheva saw someone lurking nearby, but they escaped as well. Our new goal is to find a nearby vehicle that we can use to send the data to HQ. We can take an elevator in this abandoned building, which leads downstairs. Here we find a furnace room with a key to get moving forward. As we're heading out, though, we encounter a strange new leech monster, a writhing beast with small tentacles and pods all over it. It is incredibly strong, and we definitely can't defeat it on our own at this point in the game. This is technically our first boss fight of the game, but it's a pretty simple one. The main thing we do is head back into the furnace room and lure the monster into the furnace. We can then close the doors and blast the thing with fire to destroy it. It's just a really simple encounter that didn't bring me much tension. Part of this is in the poor design. We have to head back to the double door furnace to get the key before we even meet the boss. And as soon as you lay eyes on the furnace, you know what you're in for. You know what you're going to have to do and how to do it. There's no fear or quick thinking here. The game is designed to put the solution in front of you beforehand, just in case you wouldn't understand and possibly die to this boss. God forbid you die to a boss. To be fair, though, to the game, it's a pretty short encounter, and there are a lot better bosses later in this entry. After we defeat it, Chris and Sheva head upstairs only to see someone watching them on nearby CCTV cameras. It's Irving and the masked person that we saw from the intro to the game. They head out and Chris uploads the data to HQ. HQ thanks him for the data, but tells the two that their mission still stands. They must capture Irving, who seems to have fled to the mines on the other side of town. Chris and Sheva are understandably apprehensive about taking this on by themselves. Delta Team is supposed to arrive as backup, but going in alone is basically asking to lose.
Proceed to the mines beyond the station. Over and out.
This is insane!
You ever get the feeling you're expendable?
This ends Chapter 1-2 and begins Chapter 2-1 of the game. Heading out of this building, we'll have to weave through some more Kijuju to get to the mines. We're stuck in narrow hallways littered with traps and infected dogs, which the game refers to as Ajule. These are pretty similar to the infected dogs from previous games, except these split their heads open and grow stronger when mutating. They can overwhelm us pretty quick, and a pack of them is a dangerous situation. Chris and Sheva eventually cross a bridge where a truck tries to run them over, navigate some underground tunnels, and eventually get swarmed at the docks. During this, we will encounter another new enemy, one that's a bit more unique than infected dogs. The Kipepeo are a mutated insect that bursts from the head of a recently dead Majini. In some sick way, they resemble infected butterflies, large wings, small body. They fly around and throw projectiles at us. There's something reminiscent of the insects in Resident Evil 4, but they don't land as often as those did. Heading through the docks is an intense escape mission, a fight for our lives to barely scrape by and survive. We are overwhelmed by another horde and must last long enough for Kirk to blast the barricades in front of us. A chopper flying overhead, infected rushing around us from every direction. It's a pretty tense scene and stands as a pretty great representation of what Resident Evil 5 is going for with its tone. Large set pieces that carve out a goal for themselves. This goal, rather than focusing on fear and atmosphere, sets its sights on intensity and speed. We carve through some nearby buildings, and eventually Kirk is taken out of the air by a swarm of Kipapeos. Add Kirk to the list of pilots dead in the Resident Evil series. R.I.P. Kirk. Without air support, we're forced to go at it alone and manage by ourselves. In the next area, we have to send Sheva to another building to unlock a door for us. While this happens, our job is to watch over her and ensure she isn't swarmed. Resident Evil 5 puts a larger emphasis on environmental combat than any other game in the series. This was something that the developers set out to do from the very beginning. Exploding barrels, electric boxes, oil drums, around every corner is something for us to shoot, something to blow up, chaos to be made. All of these items are opportunities, moments of potential that exist in theory as soon as you see them. The amount of satisfaction achieved from the future combat encounter is up to how well you can time your usage of these things. But I have to say that the environmental items in this game are incredibly satisfying to use, just as satisfying as when they were introduced back in Resident Evil 3. Shooting an exploding barrel and grabbing a few kills feels great. Just as you think you're overwhelmed and become conscious of how little ammo you have, you realize that you have an ace up your sleeve, a way to kill 3 or 4 or even 5 enemies with 1 bullet instead. As Chris and Sheva head out of this area, they are attacked by a new enemy type, which isn't really a new enemy type at all. The Chainsaw Majini is basically the same thing as the Chainsaw Man from Resident Evil 4. If there's really one complaint that I have with this game, it's just that it retreads so much ground from the previous entry. There are certain things from that game that just felt like they were meant for that world, like they existed in Spain only and shouldn't really be making big appearances outside of that. And you could make the case that the original Resident Evil trilogy reused a lot of enemies, but Resident Evil 5 was on a new generation of consoles. In such a distinct area and setting, it feels like the enemies should be revamped as well. Of course, this isn't the only enemy that gets reused from Resident Evil 4, but it just makes those monsters feel less unique when they're stripped out of that setting. After this little mini boss fight, we escape the area and our 2 main characters end up in an open field where they are attacked by Majini on motorcycles. Infected men doing sick jumps on bikes wielding chains. It's very awesome. This is the point in the game where things start to ramp up and get a little crazier, though I wouldn't really classify Resident Evil 5 as going off the rails until the second half of the game. Sheva and Chris are eventually rescued by Josh Stone of the BSAA. Josh was Sheva's original mentor in the organization and was responsible for bringing her up in the group. Josh tells Chris and Sheva once again that they need to keep looking for Irving and that he still might be in the mines. But when Chris sees the information stored on the chip, he sees a ghost from his past. Jill Valentine seems to be alive, possibly in the area. Chris tries to brush this under the rug to his new partner, but it's pretty clear that this is something that he won't let go of so easily.
Chris, are you all right?
This picture, it's... forget it. It's nothing. Let's move out.
This ends Chapter 2.1 and moves us into Chapter 2.2 of the game. The first thing we'll do is head outside and make our way through a train area, a section that has actually terrible level design. It's a short little area, but this place is designed to naturally funnel you into a dead end for no reason. You eventually figure out that you need to climb on top of the trains, but the level isn't designed to guide the player that way. It's nonsensical. This section does take us directly into the mines though, with another asinine section directly after. Chris and Sheva are trapped in a dark mine shaft, and one character has to hold the light while the other is in charge of shooting the zombies that inevitably attack. It's moments like these where Resident Evil 5's systems start to break down, when the minutia of commanding your partner to put down the light just to swap items with them and then have them pick it up again really starts to grate on you. It seems like these systems are fine for general combat, but once you start to introduce other mechanics and secondary objectives, it just feels like you're fighting against it. The next section is thankfully a bit better though, as we get to fight a group of enemies in this huge mine shaft. There's 3 tiers to this thing, and the intensity of being focused on by a huge group while we're at the bottom of a great cavern really sets in. The verticality is done really well here. Eventually, Chris and Sheva get an elevator out of the mines into a large facility. Here we find Irving trying to escape, wielding a gun. Irving sounds like he's doing some sort of weird half Smeagol impression, half gangster mob movie accent.
Wow, perceptive, aren't ya?
You think this is a joke? You're just like all the other pieces of scum terrorists.
Oh, I'm not like them. I'm a businessman with standards.
It's so goofy, and it plays further into the whole B-action movie quality that this game has to it. Unfortunately, before we can find anything out or capture Irving, he is rescued by the masked stranger that we've seen appear again and again. Luckily, he left behind some notes, and it seems like he's heading to the nearby oil field in the marshlands. In this building, we are completely outflanked. We have to escape, contending with a massive turret on the other side of the wall. We then are tasked with pushing through a wall of enemies stationed on this cliffside. Eventually destroying them gets us to a small encampment where Irving has left another BOW in an attempt to stop us. This is our second true boss battle of the game against the Popo Karimu. This is a BOW that was clearly mutated using bat DNA, but in that mutation, this grotesque creature has gained a huge pod on its underside. The thing will fly and chase us around the environment. It'll even destroy these small buildings around us if its attacks manage to come into contact with them. They are leveled and the resources that they held are left scattered to the ground. Its weak spot seems to be on its stomach, so we need to use explosives to stun the thing so we can run up behind it and deliver crippling damage. The monster threatens to take out our pair, but Chris, of course, takes it out in the most badass way possible. A member of the BSAA shows up to rescue us once again, and we hop in the back of a Humvee with 2 mounted guns strapped to it. This ends Chapter 2.2 and begins Chapter 2.3, which is an on-rails shooter chapter. This is literally the only part of the game that's like this, discounting a half on-rails, half not boat section later. I'm not really sure why they just threw it in here. The first section is pretty fun though. I can't say that the on-rails shooting is bad. It's pretty great, and Resident Evil was no stranger to this genre at this point. We basically defend the Humvee while Majini chase us on motorcycles and trucks. The vehicle eventually hits a roadblock and we're forced to jump a destroyed bridge. On the other side though, just as the BSAA operatives head out of the vehicle, a massive monster comes after them. Chris and Sheva are isolated, and an Indesu attacks. This is our next boss battle against what is basically a reuse of the El Gigante from the last game. This is, in my opinion, a much worse example of Resident Evil 5 retreading old ground. We're fighting the same boss, but we're also fighting that boss in a really bad, terribly long on-rails shooting section. Everything about this fight is inferior to the El Gigante fight in Resident Evil 4. We shoot turrets that overheat if we use them too much, but it only takes a second or two to cool down, so it isn't really a hurdle we have to overcome. We can basically keep shooting the entire time and just have to target these pods on the Indesu's body so that it will release the parasite on its back. This deals real damage, but we have to do this 3 or 4 times before the boss actually dies. It just takes so long, and the boss ends up recycling attacks over and over again. It also just feels so out of place in the rest of the game. I was shocked that this section was here because it really feels like this weird little detour when you compare it to everything else. They could have easily just went in one of the Wii shooter games as an addition to Resident Evil 5's story, but here it is, smacked randomly in the middle of the game. It's also just a much more poorly designed version of the El Gigante. The idea seems to be to make the El Gigante look more human by giving him a beard. Cool. This grotesque monster now just looks like an old guy. After we defeat the boss, Sheva hopes that Josh survived the attack. Chris tells her that she doesn't have to stick around, that he can go it alone now. He finally reveals that the original reason he took this mission was because he received intel that Jill might be alive. He has to keep going because things have gotten personal for him. Sheva questions whether it's even the same person, but Chris stomps off, declaring,
We were partners. I'm sure.
Wait! Wait! You're not going alone!
Sheva, of course, relents and decides to support Chris because that's what partners do. This is the first hint of the overarching theme that this game carries, what it means to be a partner, and trusting that partner. It's not that Chris doesn't trust Sheva, he just doesn't view her like that yet. He tells her that he doesn't really need her to finish this mission, that he can go on by himself. He still thinks of Jill as his partner and Sheva as this woman that he just met. This dynamic and relationship will change over the course of the game, and while Resident Evil 5's story can be slow to start, its themes and finale are some of my favorite parts of the series so far. There are certain aspects of this game that do manage to exceed anything else in the series when it comes to my personal tastes, and the only reason it doesn't really stand up to the rest of the series overall is because the greater package is dragged down by little mistakes that pile up. Sheva catches up with Chris, telling him that this issue is personal for her too. She's from here, these are her people as well, but Chris makes it pretty clear that they're moving solo from here on out.
There are no more orders from here on in. It's just us.
We're partners. To the end. Now let's get moving.
This marks the end of Chapter 2-3 and the beginning of Chapter 3 of the game. At the beginning of this chapter, we arrive in the wetlands. Before the group investigates the area, though, Chris tells Sheva about his old partner, Jill. We get a flashback sequence that shows a recent event where Jill and Chris were trying to find Wesker. They tracked down Spencer, the founder of Umbrella, to his secluded mansion estate. When they arrived, they found Wesker, but Spencer was already killed. Chris and Jill got their asses absolutely handed to them by the augmented being that is Albert Wesker, though. Chris was about to be killed by Wesker before Jill tackled him into the window. Jill's body was never found, and Chris is hanging on to the hope that she's still alive.
I have to know if she's still alive.
You two were close.
We were partners.
This is important because the way that Chris answers this question means that partners, to him, means close. Sheva then reveals a bit of her backstory, that her parents were involved in an accident when she was young. Both of her parents died, and of course, Umbrella was behind it. The accident was a cover-up for biological weapons being sold to terrorists. Africa has been being used as a test bed for these viruses for a while. This is why she decided to join the BSAA to begin with. The two make a pact to take the people behind this down once and for all. With this, we enter the second large area of the game, the wetlands. The wetlands is a sprawling sort of swamp. Here we will encounter the regressed tribes of this land, infected people living in these areas that have suddenly begun to act strange. Just like the Ganados in Resident Evil 4 eventually turned into ritual-practicing cultists, the Majini in Resident Evil 5 have now turned into tribal infected, wielding spears and torches. We will fight a variety of these enemies here. This variety is mostly made up of different weaponry, crossbows, spears, etc. The large Majini, though, are the fearsome mini-bosses of this area, massive beasts warped by the Plagas to grow in size and dexterity. They deal a ton of damage and require massive amounts of ammunition to be taken down. Navigating the wetlands, though, is the interesting part. For the first time in the game, we're allowed to roam free across a wide open area. The first 2 chapters of the game, and most of the rest of it outside of this one specific area, will be very linear. This is sort of implemented like the lake was in Resident Evil 4, an area that allows us to breathe a little bit and pursue things in our way. The driving force behind this section, though, is finding 4 pieces of a door lock to proceed. One is found directly by the lock, and the other 3 are found spread out across the map in different encampments. We can optionally stop at different islands, one holding various chickens and their eggs, just like in the last game. While I do appreciate the fact that the game allows us to free roam in this area, I don't think it really hits the spot for the most part. The big reason that exploration was so good in Resident Evil 4 was because it was satisfying. Extra ammo and equipment felt like meaningful boosts. For the most part, I kept the same guns that I had from this point in the game on in Resident Evil 5. I upgraded to a new shotgun when the merchant allowed, but I never really felt like these upgrades mattered all that much. Also, because the treasure system is downgraded in Resident Evil 5, we don't have as much of a reason to engage with these systems. Of course, we do get treasures, but because we don't need to get every treasure, it's not as important. There just isn't any heft to exploration in Resident Evil 5, so you never really feel like you should go out of your way because you aren't always rewarded for doing so. This leaves all of these areas just feeling like new combat encounters rather than moments of opportunity. And that's fine. That certainly places the focus on combat more than it does the ancillary things off to the side. But it left me feeling like I didn't need to see every single part of this world to get the gist. After we avoid some crocodiles and use our new whip to gallivant around the wetlands, we can unlock the door ahead. This leads into a proper wetlands village where we are quickly set upon by a much larger group of fighters. This, for some reason, was the most buggy area of the game for me. Both times I played this in co-op and solo, the game had issues spawning in the characters properly. They would often get stuck in the walls, but they could still manage to shoot projectiles at me. Eventually, gaining access to the bridge in this area, we can activate a gondola that closes this chapter and begins Chapter 3-2 of the game. We have a very simple sequence in the next area that has us activating a raft into this building. Here we find some odd tents that are labeled from a company called Tricell. We're pretty quickly thrust into the center of an oil field. Here we have to turn off the leaking pipes to get to the next area. Of course, we have to do this while being pestered by tons of Majini and a few chainsaw variants. After this section, Chris and Sheva meet up with Josh Stone again. He thankfully survived the last encounter, but gets the regretful news that his team is dead. As soon as the pair explain that they're looking for Jill, they are locked in the room and attacked by a group of enemies. We have to defend Josh while he gets the elevator working. Heading up the elevator, we have to make a quick escape attempt through the facility. This was a very intense moment in the game, and a small but bright point for me. We're waiting for Josh to get the door open and just watching this powerful flood of enemies wash over us. They get closer and closer, and we know we don't have the equipment to defeat them. It's such a great piece, but this is Resident Evil 5's greatest strength. The moments where it leans even further into the action and intensity. On the other side, Josh splits up from us and heads out to find an escape. Chris and Sheva have to find Irving, still, who plans to blow up the oil refinery, hoping to escape under the cover of the flames. We pretty quickly find Irving on a massive yacht. He and his masked lackey escape. We're overrun once again by zombies and have to head to the other side of the dock with only 2 minutes to do so. Once we get there, the factory explodes and we barely escape as the group watches the facility go down in flames. This marks the end of Chapter 3-2 and the beginning of Chapter 3-3. We get another on-rails shooting sequence where we have to defend the boat against a barrage of enemies. This section is a little different though. It's broken up by short parts where we have to get off the boat and lift up a door blocking our way. The game just absolutely floods you with enemies at this point, most of which you're probably supposed to just run past and get the switch. It's a hectic situation, especially because the pathways that we walk on are so narrow. There's barely any room to run, so we just have to blast our way through. Once we finally get through this section, we cap off Chapter 3 with a massive boss battle. Catching up to Irving's ship, we're shot at by the black market dealer. Before Chris and Jill hop aboard the ship, Irving has a flashback. He was being pressured by the masked stranger to use some sort of virus sample and to take out Jill and Chris. Irving injects himself with the virus, but not before telling our main characters that he's the one that got this entire operation off the ground. All the research here is being funded by the money he earns from his black market operations. The injection, of course, mutates Irving, and if there's one thing that this game has in spades, it's incredibly grotesque mutation sequences. Irving has tentacles piercing through his back, and he jumps in the water before becoming what is essentially a large Kraken-type creature. This enemy is massive, and the only way that we can take it out is by using the mounted guns on the side of the ship. We have to shoot various pods and arms that pop out of the water to prevent ourselves from being hurt. Doing damage to the infected Irving is actually as simple as blasting his body full of bullets when it rises from the water. This can only be done when the mouth opens and reveals it, though. We do this enough and Irving's mutated body is amputated, falling aboard the ship. Chris tries to ask the man some questions before he dies, specifically about the Ouroboros project. He doesn't exactly give us any information, though, only vague warnings about the project, that it was to reshape the balance of the world, and that it's far too late to stop it. And with that, Gangster Smeagol is dead. This ends Chapter 3-3 and begins Chapter 4 of the game. Before Irving died, he said that our answers lie in that cave over there.
All your answers await ahead, Chris. In that cave.
You know, that cave over there on a moving ship. So we head to the cave and we find the boat that the masked stranger used to escape earlier. Josh Stone is heading back to talk to HQ to get more support for this mission. This next area of the game is very similar to the caves that we encounter in Resident Evil 4. We fight a new insect-like enemy here, the Bui Quichua. These are sort of the swarm enemy of Resident Evil 5. They're weak and don't take many shots, but if we have to take too many of them on at once, we can easily get overwhelmed. But the caves aren't a very large area, because these caves quickly give way to the ruins, a massive network of dilapidated structures. Ancient buildings relegated to this underground cavern. The wetlands Magini appear again down here, protecting these ruins from anyone that would try to invade them. We get separated here pretty quickly from Sheva. We have to defend ourselves from the onslaught while reuniting with our partner. Getting out of these ruins entails solving a massive puzzle. There are various statues around this room that we have to use to raise stairs about the place. Each staircase changes the path through the area, and half of the environment is already destroyed, meaning that things start to deteriorate as we gain entry into new parts of this room. And once we finally get the stairs aligned correctly, we get attacked by another Popo Karimu. We don't actually have to defeat this one though, we can just run out of the area and the beast is trapped under a door. Leaving this place, we'll see two new characters talking. Excella Gion, someone we'll learn more about later, is injecting a yet-to-be-revealed character with a serum. This is very obviously Albert Wesker. Excella is working with the company Tricell, but she's also working with Wesker to further his plans with this Ouroboros project we've been hearing so much about. Excella is basically trying to sleep with Wesker to get a better place in this plan he envisions for himself. Before we can learn more about these two, though, the masked stranger informs Wesker that the BSAA agents have arrived. Wesker sends his 2 agents off to deal with them, as his plan is almost ready. We then see a flashback from Wesker here to the night that he killed Spencer.
New superior breed creating a new world genital virus. You used to become a god. That right is now mine.
This ends Chapter 4.1 and begins Chapter 4.2. We head into the worship area, another large temple with varying paths. But this time, the Magini are using some sort of device to focus sunlight and direct it at the walkways in the area. We have to time our rushes correctly to be able to navigate around these beams. The general goal in this area is just to grab various plates hidden around the ruins, just like in the wetlands area of the game. Once we do this and head out, we have what I would call the first actual puzzle of the game. Sure, we had areas where we needed to grab tablets to put in a door. We had places where we had to lift stairs and such, but those weren't traditional puzzles. Here we have to direct beams of sunlight into the correct dais so that we can move down to the next level. Even though this is the first true puzzle of the game, I wouldn't exactly call it that complex. This is honestly one of the things that Resident Evil 5 lacks quite a bit in, is actual puzzles to take up its runtime. It often feels like, for stretches of the game, that we'll just be running rooms, defeating enemies, and heading out the other side. A large portion of this feeling comes from the fact that in the beginning of the game, there isn't a lot of narrative hooks to keep us busy either. You'll notice that many scenes in the beginning of the game result in essentially the same information. Get Ricardo Irving. We need to stop him. Still need to get Ricardo Irving. Hey guys, what's up? Yeah, you still gotta get Ricardo Irving. The story of the game doesn't really feel like it starts until past the halfway mark of the game. Combine that with the fact that we don't really get many puzzles in this entry, and you're left with a series of rooms set up one after the other with combat encounters inside. Not exactly as intriguing or gripping as the previous games in the series. After this little mirror puzzle, we finally get to the bottom of the ruins. Chris and Sheva happen upon a field of red flowers. Sheva asks the obvious question, how can they survive under here? Something is strange about these plants, but Chris quickly notices an umbrella crate sitting off to the side. Some of the equipment is from our old friends, but some of it is also labeled Tricell. This ends Chapter 4.2 and starts 5.1. As we begin this chapter, we can read a ton of different notes here that start to really flesh out the story that's going on in this game. It's unfortunate that a lot of the really interesting stuff here is all happening in the background. Half in the game, but half in memos and files only accessible from the main menu. In the interest of brevity, I'll just explain the background that we get here. This facility was originally used because during the formation of Umbrella, Spencer wanted to find a virus that could alter DNA. They found this virus, which was later referred to as the progenitor, in these ruins. It came in the form of a flower called the Stairway to the Sun. The people in the area knew about the flower, particularly the tribes local to the region. These people would consume this flower, and though only a few of them survived the process, the ones that did would become strong warriors. When Umbrella started building here and taking over their land, they tried to fight back and became a thorn in the side of the company for a while. 2 researchers were instrumental in this early development of the virus, Brandon Bailey and James Marcus. We find out a lot of this information through Bailey's journals, but Marcus would eventually become head of the training facility that we see in Resident Evil 0. This whole process started in the 60s, and once they finally pushed the tribes out of the ruins, they gained free access to the flower and its virus. Bailey was then stationed here for a long time, sending samples of the virus back to Marcus and the rest of the researchers working on a final sample. Of course, this eventually resulted in the T-virus and all of the events of the original trilogy of games. This is the true origin of the virus, in these flowers, in a small set of ruins in Africa. But how does Tricell fit into this whole thing? Tricell is another large pharmaceutical company, a part of the GCP. They originally began as a trading company called Travis Trading. In the 1800s, Henry Travis, a descendant of the founder of the company, started his expeditions into Africa. He compiled many books on the flora and fauna of the continent and returned with this information. His brother began spreading rumors that his book was full of lies and made-up entries, but it was actually all true. Henry would die shortly after this book failed, and all of this was orchestrated by his brother so that he could use the secrets in the book to harvest resources from the land. Travis Trading would eventually become Tricell after they expanded their operation to include not just shipping, but also a pharmaceutical wing and a natural resources operation. After this, the three heads would become Tricell. Tricell was involved in the creation of the BSAA as well. Not appreciating the negative publicity that came along with the downfall of Umbrella and their connection to the company, they helped the anti-terrorism operation to bolster their PR. They would eventually take over this very lab where Umbrella was harvesting the progenitor virus to try and create something new. Excellagione is wrapped up in the company somehow, and so is Wesker. So those reveals are for what's to come. But the background information actually holds the secret to the whole series. How Umbrella found the virus, how they started as a company, and why these viruses still plague the world to this day. As we move through this area, we'll also encounter information hinting that a Type 3 Plagas was in development as well. We're basically told that we're going to be fighting Lickers soon, and those enemies return right after. The game quickly starts to get pretty intense, as we can avoid all of these enemies by walking slow and not making any noise, or we can trigger the attacks of a dozen Lickers all at once by making the wrong move. I clearly did this wrong and was never smart enough to get through this section without it. Defeating the Lickers allows us access into a deeper part of this Umbrella base. Here we find a massive facility shaft where hundreds of bodies are being stored in cryosleep. Chris thinks Jill could be stored in one of these pods. For some reason, the facility randomly drops one of these folks to their death. Sorry, guy. Chris manages to find Jill's entry in the computer, but the elevator we're on starts moving. It eventually stops and we're attacked by our next boss, the absolutely massive U8. The U8 is a combination of a variety of different species. It takes an armored shell from the crustacean DNA though, which means that our bullets are pretty ineffective at piercing its outer layer. The only way to damage it is to target its mouth when it's stunned. We can stun the beast by firing at the pods on its legs. Standing in front of it is just asking to die, so we have to circle the platform and avoid the boss while it periodically spits out flying creatures to attack us. It's actually a pretty decent boss battle overall, though much like the other boss battles in the game, it goes on a bit too long. It isn't that difficult, and once you get the gist of what you're supposed to do, you just rinse and repeat until it's dead. But once you've locked in the strategy, you're almost just waiting for the battle to be over since the challenge isn't really there. After defeating it, Chris manages to find Jill's pod, but her body isn't present. We get a call from Excellagione, who Sheva already knows about. She tells Chris and Jill to leave because there isn't anything here, but this is clearly a lie meant to deter our heroes. This ends Chapter 5.1 and begins Chapter 5.2 of the game. We're now in this Umbrella facility proper, which is our next actual area of the game. Surrounded by familiar laboratory hallways and pumping machinery, this finale feels at home in the Resident Evil franchise. But this also introduces probably one of the strangest mechanics in the game: cover. Right at the game's latter third, it decides to introduce enemies that can use weapons, guard magini as the game refers to them. Since these enemies can shoot at us, of course we need to take cover, but randomly the game all of a sudden becomes a cover shooter for its final couple of hours. This is such a strange choice, and I assume it was to play on the current trends at the time, considering Gears of War was one of the biggest third-person shooter series out there. The cover system is incredibly awkward. You can't move behind the covered barriers, you either just stay stationary or pop out to shoot. It also doesn't feel like it really fits in this game and just makes this whole last sequence feel very out of place. Resident Evil 5, in some ways, feels like it's having an identity crisis. Like it wasn't sure what the series was about to turn into, so it tried out a few different things in the interest of giving the team multiple ways forward. Regardless, we move our way through this lab, often targeted by soldiers that do a ton of damage with rifles and rocket launchers. The combat here is more about timing rather than accuracy. Boarding an elevator, Chris taps into a transmission of Excella talking to Wesker. Chris finally realizes that his old rival is still alive. We then deal with some more lickers and have a long sequence where we have to contend with tons of enemies on these conveyor belts. This is also a really weird section, but in kind of a fun way. The conveyor belts are literally just pumping out exploding canisters, so this whole place is Explosion City. We even meet a new monster type here, another insect called the Reaper. The Reaper can't be destroyed with raw damage. We have to target the pods on its body one by one. It isn't that threatening of an enemy because you stun them pretty fast, but it's an interesting mechanic for this game. It's also unique to note that you can drag this monster onto a conveyor belt that ends in a furnace and just leave it to its fate. After trolling around in the factory, we finally reach a lab where real research is being done. Pods full of fluids and test subjects, and a man sitting on a chair. Excella and the masked stranger are overlooking this scene. Excella basically tells Chris if he wants Ouroboros so bad, here it is. The thing reveals itself, taking over the host. Excella says they don't plan to sell this BOW, but to use it to evolve the human species. The virus pretty quickly begins to reject its host and turns into something that we've seen before. We fought the Ouroboros BOW already at the beginning of the game, which honestly kind of makes this reveal fall a bit flat. The boss fight itself is kind of needlessly confusing, but it is supposed to be a big moment for the game. They've been hinting at the Ouroboros reveal since the beginning, but now we just get a monster that we've already encountered before. To beat Ouroboros this time, though, we don't have a fancy double-door locking furnace just lying around. We have to blast both of its arms off, and only then have either Sheva or Chris burn it up with a flamethrower. Since it's weak to fire, this will cause pods to sprout from its body that are its actual weak spot. It's kind of a bitch to do because shooting its arms off has to be done quickly, and the monster can regrow them pretty fast. Luckily, a rocket launcher or fire grenade will put it into an automatic weak spot mode for a short period of time. Killing this thing ends Chapter 5-2 and begins Chapter 5-3. Chris and Sheva determine that they need to stop Wesker and Excella's plan, so we make our way through some more factory environments, eventually looping back around to another elevator in the pods room. This elevator rotates as it moves up floors though, which is incredibly disorienting since we have to shoot enemies while it moves. Easily one of the strangest design choices that this game makes. It made me very dizzy. Once Chris and Sheva exit the facility and lower a bridge that allows them access into a tri-cell facility, we corner Excella. Then the masked stranger appears and shows off their incredible powers in a pretty cool fight scene. Wesker is here too, and he makes the big reveal of the game. Yes, Jill was the masked stranger all along. You probably could have seen this coming from a mile away. I know I sure did. It gets hinted at many times throughout the game, and it's basically revealed when her body is already missing from the pod. Jill is actually being controlled by Wesker through this small red device on her chest. So how does the bug work? Where was Jill all this time? Why does she have blonde hair? It's a pretty complicated explanation, but it's just insane and convoluted enough to be Resident Evil. Basically, Jill was captured by Wesker after they both fell out of the mansion that night. He wanted to exact his revenge on both Chris and Jill by experimenting on her. She had a mutated form of the T-virus inside of her though, and Wesker decided to keep her in cryosleep. But because she was in cryosleep for so long, it turned her hair blonde for some reason. The cryosleep also gave her incredibly powerful antibodies against the virus. Wesker wanted to use these antibodies to make his new Ouroboros virus less deadly, but once he got the strain working, he didn't need her anymore. While doing his research, though, Wesker found a completely unrelated chemical called P30, which enhanced the abilities of a human being. This only lasted for so long, and Wesker created a device that would regularly administer the chemical, hence the red mechanical bug on her chest. It's absolutely batshit insane, but if you question anything too much, it all falls apart, so just don't. Jill attacks Sheva and Chris now that Wesker has fully unleashed her, and we have a boss battle against the both of them. Wesker says that he only has 7 minutes to spare us. There's basically 2 phases to this fight. First, we have to deal with Wesker, who we really can't damage all that much because he can just dodge all of our bullets. We eventually have to run away from him and essentially wait for the clock to tick down. After this, Wesker determines we aren't worth the time and leaves Jill to take care of our heroes. Wouldn't that be a fitting end? Chris killed by his former partner Jill, who unknowingly murdered her friend? Well, it doesn't exactly go like that. We then fight Jill in a sort of not really boss battle. We don't need to kill Jill here, we need to remove the bug from her chest. To do this, we have to work together with Sheva and get our new partner to hold her down so we can either pry it from her chest or shoot it. Once this is done, Jill is finally back. She was aware of everything the whole time, but she wasn't in control. She tells Chris and Sheva to head off and stop Wesker while she finds a way out of here. Chris is obviously reluctant, but she convinces Chris with one line.
Don't you trust your partner?
All right.
This is pretty obviously furthering our big theme here, what it means to be a partner. We'll return to this once the story has closed out, but for now, Chris and Sheva head outside to see Excella and Wesker boarding a ship. This ends Chapter 5-3 and begins Chapter 6 of the game, our finale. Chris and Sheva are suddenly on board this huge ship, which we now have to infiltrate. This section, for some reason, sheds the cover system that it just introduced, and we're back to the classic infected killing action. I do like this section, but again, just like a lot of things in this game, it feels like it's kind of out of place. It doesn't really feel like we're building up to the finale for this entry. Even the whole time we're here, the characters are asking what this tanker is being used for. That doesn't mean that the finale of this game doesn't stick the landing, but it's just paced out poorly. Once it finally gets going, it doesn't stop until the credits, but the game takes a while to reach that point. Once we get to the testing facility in this ship, Excella escapes without giving us information once again. She does manage to drop some samples of a strange chemical. Exiting this area, we're back into standard cover game shooter again as we progress through the underside of this tanker. Eventually, we see Wesker, who is having another flashback. He's speaking of the Wesker children. Albert Wesker was the only one who survived. He's basically telling Wesker that he was manufactured. Spencer was trying to become a god in every way, but Wesker stole this from him, forming his own plans to reshape the world. Back out on the tanker, Chris and Sheva see Excella going through a mutation. A mountain of bodies stand behind her. Wesker has betrayed his muse, and she's going to become something more grotesque, as Ouroboros is rejecting her host as well. This doesn't turn into the monster that we saw before, though. It begins feeding on all the organic material around it and turns into a giant mass of tentacles and pods. This immediately begins to take over the entire ship, and our two heroes manage to escape unscathed. I haven't talked about this until now, but there are a ton of little cutscenes in this game that seem like they were originally meant to have QTEs. This is one example of that, and I'd imagine that they pulled them out at the end of development because they knew fans would have a negative reaction. They just look really goofy because we aren't inputting anything here, but Sheva and Chris keep getting caught up. The two end up escaping into the tanker. We have to escape this place as the tentacles begin to break the hull. I actually love this scene because you see out the windows and witness the monster that's waiting for us. Once we get to the top, we have a boss battle with the mutated Excella. We stand on two platforms and have to damage the pods on the writhing mass in front of us. We can use this laser targeting device that communicates with a satellite that focuses and sends a fucking laser beam down to damage the boss. This is one of my favorite fights in the game because the scope is just so massive. We've never fought anything this large before, never went up against an event this world-altering. It's huge, and it just feels like it really gives a lot of scope to what Wesker was trying to do here. Also, it just looks cool, which is what this game is all about at the end of the day. Eventually, we destroy this thing, and Chris and Sheva find Wesker ready to board a plane that will spread the Ouroboros virus across the planet. Jill contacts us and tells Chris that Wesker is getting his strength and speed from a serum that he regularly injects himself with. Jill theorizes that injecting him with too much could act like a poison, and then her feed cuts out. It's the same chemical that we found before, so that will be the only way to defeat him. We learn here, mostly from a memo, that Wesker's plan is basically to end the world. The Ouroboros virus will mostly reject people when administered. The ones that it doesn't reject will be deemed worthy and the next evolution of the human species. This is Wesker's final form, his final plan, his last evolution and chance to become a god. We have to escape the tanker at this point, destroying all kinds of Magini and infected insects on our way out. We finally reach the hangar face to face with Wesker once and for all. He distracts Chris by throwing his glasses at him, and the two have a pretty great showdown. Wesker claims that he is saving the world from itself. By forcefully evolving humanity, they won't be killed off. But Wesker and Chris are confronting each other for the last time. Only one of them is getting out of this alive. The first phase of our boss battle with Wesker starts here, and it is absolutely insane. We can only attack Wesker when he can't see us, when we're in the dark. Stupid idiot shouldn't wear sunglasses all the time. But we don't need to actually damage Wesker here. We need to inject him with the serum that Sheva has. The way we can do this is by firing a rocket launcher at Wesker, which he can obviously stop with his superior physical ability. This stuns him for long enough so that we can hold him and inject him with the serum. This poisons Wesker and causes him to escape off into his jet. Chris and Sheva barely make it onto the vehicle. Face to face with Wesker again, he lets us know that there's 5 minutes left until the vehicle disperses the Ouroboros virus across the world. We get another absolutely badass fight scene here. Whenever Wesker's on screen, this game excels. I think it took a long time for the series to really figure out what Wesker should be, and the answer was a mustache-twirling villain that is trying to destroy the world. Chris eventually injects Wesker with more of the serum, and he activates the hatch on the ship. Since the plane is flying directly into the sky, everyone begins to fall out of the back. Wesker and Sheva are about to die, but for a moment, Chris sees Jill in his new partner. He realizes that this is his chance to do what he couldn't with Jill, to redeem himself, to actually save his partner. This is the climax of the theme that Resident Evil 5 has been building to throughout this entire game. While it isn't overt, there's a bit of a disconnect at the beginning of the game between Sheva and Chris. Chris is constantly talking about his partner, which he still considers to be Jill. You almost feel bad for Sheva because Chris is focusing so much on Jill when he has a partner right here that he's just looking past. Sheva has to prove herself before Chris will even realize this, going off the planned mission and heading with him to look for Jill. The game even seems confused on who Chris's actual partner is, because if Sheva dies at any point during the game, we get a game over, and the game over screen tells us your partner is dead. But the same message is displayed if we accidentally kill Jill during her boss fight. The theme here is clear. Chris is still stuck on Jill as his partner. He cares about her clearly, and if he moved on and forgot about her, then he wouldn't have saved her life in this game. But Chris also harbors a lot of unspoken guilt here for what happened. He wishes that he could have saved Jill that night, and he considers it his mission to right that wrong, if possible. He does right that wrong by saving Jill, but he doesn't even realize that he has another partner here that he needs to hold up his end for as well. And he does this in the end. He saves Sheva, and this story comes full circle. I love the overall theme for this game, and it feels far more personal than any other Resident Evil game has been so far. It's a very wholesome story and gives Chris a ton of depth in the overall scheme of things. I do think this whole story would fit a lot better if Jill did actually die in that mansion that night. Of course, that would be a bold move to kill a large series character off screen and then show it in a DLC, but it definitely would have made Chris's journey more impactful. Regardless, Chris completes his journey and saves Sheva. This comes just before the ship is about to crash into a currently active volcano. Wesker falls out of the ship beforehand, and Chris and Sheva end up walking around this mountain. Wesker is, of course, still alive, but what better place for our final fight of this game than in the center of an actual fucking volcano? This fight is nothing less than insane. Chris punches a boulder, Wesker uses a tornado move with his new tentacles. It's the wildest this series has gotten to this point. This boss battle is a collaborative effort between Chris and Sheva. The two are split up at the beginning, and Sheva has to distract Wesker so that she can get over to where we are. Like I said, Chris punches a fucking boulder because of his swole status, and the two are reunited. Once this happens, we have to target the pod/heart on Wesker's chest to finally kill him. Chris and Sheva get rescued by Jill and Josh, but this game could only end in one way. Chris and Sheva fire dual rocket launchers to finally finish off Wesker for good.
You son of a bitch.
The four fly off into the sunset as Chris narrates his final thoughts on what just happened.
More and more, I find myself wondering if it's all worth fighting for. For a future without fear? Yeah, it's worth it.
This is the end of Resident Evil 5, but the game would actually release 2 DLCs that would work to expand the story a bit and show us some of the unseen. The first DLC that was released for the game was titled Lost in Nightmares. This short DLC places us in the shoes of both Chris and Jill as they infiltrate the Spencer estate. To be clear, this is not the Spencer mansion from the first game, though it is a near replica of that building. This is the true Spencer estate, where the founder of Umbrella actually lives. Chris and Jill are here to seek out the man in the hopes of finding Wesker. Much of the first half of this DLC is just us solving puzzles in a mansion, and honestly, I loved it. It was a breath of fresh air after an action-packed main campaign. I can't exactly say that this is what Resident Evil 5 should have been, because then I don't think it would have really been Resident Evil 5. Plus, I don't think it would have done as well with the new audience that the series had garnered after Resident Evil 4. After solving enough puzzles to enter the underground area of the estate, we do get some combat against the monsters of this manor. We eventually fall down a shaft and lose our weapons though. This neat section sees us having to lure enemies into traps since we have no other way to kill them. It's pretty intense, and it was easily my favorite part of the DLC. Solving this puzzle, though, gets us to Spencer's office, where we see the confrontation between him and Wesker. Wesker kills Spencer, and we have our face-off against him. Wesker is an incredibly annoying boss here because we basically just wait him out, but we have to survive a ton of QTEs, which require a lot of precision. Of course, we know how this ends, but the majority of the grand reveals for this sequence happen in the files of the game. Wesker met Spencer at his estate because Spencer had begun purging the company of any executives that might have knowledge of their secret programs. One of these programs was to essentially become a god and start the world anew. Spencer needed 3 things for this plan to come to fruition: the progenitor virus, the Umbrella Corporation, and Wesker. Wesker was basically an idealized person that he had created in his mind, someone that could succeed the new world in ideals and logic. Because the virus would only change physical capabilities, he had to ensure that the new world only contained people with reason and intellect. So he collected children that exhibited these qualities, calling them the Wesker children. Albert Wesker was one of these, and they were all placed in controlled environments, watched by Umbrella from afar. Albert was the only child that showed promise and was eventually administered the virus through William Birkin. This, of course, aggravates Wesker when he is told that his life is essentially a pre-programmed lie, and he kills Spencer for it. But it doesn't really matter because Wesker is dead anyways. The final DLC released for the game was called Desperate Escape, and sees us playing Jill Valentine and Josh Stone as the two try to secure an escape route after Jill is saved by Chris. This DLC has a lot less going for it. It honestly just feels like another chapter in Resident Evil 5, where we run through the ship and take down enemies. It's basically just more combat, nothing really special here. The finale sequence is okay. We have to wait out a timer on a roof and defend ourselves from a ton of infected all at once. When the pilot arrives to save the two, an infected shoots him with a rocket that somehow only damages the pilot and not our two heroes. But Josh and Jill manage to escape anyways, and obviously they set out to rescue Sheva and Chris after this. The real shining star in the extras mode of Resident Evil 5 is, of course, the Mercenaries mode. While I loved Resident Evil 4's Mercenary mode in both the original and the remake, Resident Evil 5 has an arcade shooter that is just downright addicting. There are a ton of different characters, multiple areas to fight in, massive variety. Mercenaries works just like Resident Evil 4. We have 2 minutes to kill as many enemies as possible, and killing enemies in quick succession will increase our combo meter. We can find time crystals around the map that will increase our time, and even combo time pickups that will make combos easier for a short period. I played this Mercenaries mode for far too long. I just couldn't stop trying to get a higher score, trying to do better and perfect my path through these areas. It was equal parts intense, fun, and rewarding. I can't exactly say which of the Mercenaries mode is best, but this one's certainly up there. Resident Evil 5 as a whole is a great game for what it is. The game has a ton of problems, but Resident Evil 5 feels so unique that it wouldn't really be what it is without its mistakes. Comparing this game to the last game is this weird tale of two opposites. While the games are incredibly similar at their foundation, they verge in their general appeal. Resident Evil 4 is a game that comes very close to perfection, nailing almost every aspect of the project. The mechanics all work so well with each other. It's a web of interlocking design techniques that create something much larger than itself. But Resident Evil 5 is a product that you sort of have to take at face value. You have to take the mistakes along with its perfections. It's a flawed game, but that's sort of what makes it great. Because even if there's some things that it does wrong, it feels like the game takes risks in other places to make up for it. The resulting project is this weird, kind of wacky action game that just massively goes over the top. It feels like this game could have only been made in this era. I don't really like saying you couldn't make this game today, but it's kind of true with Resident Evil 5. And it's not because people wouldn't like it, but just because we take franchises a lot more seriously now. Resident Evil 5 makes so many missteps along the way, though. It feels like it takes so many steps backwards. So many things that Resident Evil 4 did to move the series in a new direction, Resident Evil 5 just wipes those away. But that doesn't mean that the game isn't just fun to play. This game excels at being just a great action game with good mechanics and a decent story to back it up. The game is quite held up by its finale, but the rest of the game is worth focusing on as well. Despite its issues, Resident Evil 5 was incredibly successful with fans. It sold very well, in the end becoming the best-selling entry in the franchise at the time. It was also praised by critics, with the game scoring an 84 out of 100 on Metacritic. Regardless of whether this game gets a remake in the future, it still stands as a really unique entry in the series. The next entry would be a lot more divisive and would mark the sign of another change for the series moving forward. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad. Hey there, thank you again so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like it and subscribe to the channel. Also, if you want to support the channel even further, you can go to the link in my description and subscribe to the Patreon. I actually just released my review of the final Paul W.S. Anderson movie, Resident Evil, the final chapter. So go check that out if you want. I've hated most of those movies, so you can enjoy seeing me tortured over there. It's actually been a pretty good time, and now I'm going to move on to the Netflix Resident Evil stuff, and then the animated movies, which I hope are really good. I'm currently working on my review for Resident Evil 6, so keep an eye out for that, and some more special stuff coming up here soon. Thanks again for watching. See you soon. Bye, Dad.